It's time for episode 9 of the Mystical Times blog podcast with me, Michelle Eve. Somerset is a beautiful county in the West Country, and it has lush rolling hills, gorges, caves, and along with it being a largely agricultural area, and it produces the most amazing ciders and cheeses. It has also been occupied by humans since prehistoric times, so there's little wonder that it is indeed a very haunted county with many myths and legends. I'll share 3 experiences from this spooky county with you in this episode, which all come from the writings of Peter Underwood. The Candlelight Ghost. For our first visit, we'll be visiting St Audrey's Manor House in West Quantock. This haunting experience happened over 100 years ago to Peter, one of the occupants of a rather large and rambling house. Peter had returned back to the house after travelling from London to find that only his sister and a handful of servants were at the house. The night after his return, he felt very tired, so he went up to his bedroom around 10 p.m. that night. His bedroom was down a long corridor, so it was rather far from the main part of the house. He was asleep within a half an hour or so. It was some time later when he suddenly woke up. He soon realised there was a noise coming from the corridor, so he started listening attentively to try and figure out what or who was making such a noise. He called out, "Who is there?" but got no response. He called yet again, but to no avail. So he decided to get up from his bed, put on his dressing gown, which was hanging up, and went to investigate. He opened his bedroom door, only to see an old woman carrying a lit candle, just a few feet away from him. He didn't recognise her, and she gave him no response upon seeing him. So he asked, "Who are you, and what are you doing here?" He took a step towards her, and as he did this, the woman turned away and began walking down the long corridor. It was then that Peter realised something wasn't quite right about this figure, despite her looking as flesh and as blood as you and I. He then realised it was the flame on the candle. It never moved when the figure did. In fact, it was just constant and still. He began walking down the long corridor after her. Then he started to run. As the woman went through other corridors and staircases, so did Peter. Peter soon found himself down a dead-end corridor, just feet away from the woman. He saw her open a door to a room that was at the end of the corridor, and then the door slammed. There was nowhere for this woman to go, so Peter tentatively opened the door, only to find the room completely silent and empty. She could have escaped via a window, but no, the window was locked and barred and hadn't been opened in many years. Peter found the episode baffling, but made his way to bed and managed to fall back to sleep. When he awoke, he remembered what had happened, but dismissed it as a dream. He then saw his dressing gown had been draped on the floor, and then noticed the soles of his feet. The soles were dirty from walking through all the corridors and staircases when following the woman he had seen. He said nothing of his nighttime activities to his sister, and when they were having breakfast, his sister asked Peter to check the time on the grandfather clock in the hall, as the clock in the breakfast room had stopped. The clock had stopped at 2 minutes to 1. So Peter went to check the time, but the grandfather clock had also stopped, and it had stopped at 2 minutes to 1. In fact, all the clocks in the house had stopped, and all at 2 minutes to 1. Did the clock stop when Peter saw the ghostly woman with the candle? Or was it just a strange coincidence? The Ghost Dog. For our next visit, we go to an unnamed beautiful village near Taunton, where Mrs. Bolton witnessed something rather strange in her beautiful home. Mrs. Bolton's home had once been part of an old priory near to the local church. Several years before the Boltons moved in, the previous owner was having some structural work done on the house, and in one of the walls there was found a cavalier's thigh boot with a silver spur. Mrs. Bolton was an accomplished businesswoman in her working life, but had also admitted she felt she could possibly have some psychic intuition. When she and her husband moved into the property, they were told it was haunted by a little old woman, but neither had seen nor heard her. But what they both had heard was the padding of a dog's paws. They would hear the dog above them when they were downstairs. It was only Mrs. Bolton that had seen the ghost dog, and she saw it for the first time on an early April morning when she was getting breakfast before going to work. She glanced out of the window into the garden and was surprised to see a rather large grey dog in there. It had its nose to the ground and seemed to be following a scent. She wondered how the dog had got in there, as there were some very large walls to the garden and all the gates were locked. Her own dog would usually bark if someone entered the garden, but he was still in his basket and was shivering with all his hackles raised. As she was in a rush to catch her train, she left the house. At lunchtime that day, she visited a museum in the area she was working in, as she wanted to find out what breed of dog in her garden had been. She looked at many different photos of different breeds, but to no avail. She then came across an old print of the exact likeness. The dog in the print was a now almost extinct breed. It was a German boarhound. It was a few weeks later when Mrs. Bolton saw the dog again. She managed to get a better look at the dog this time and noted it was rather like an Irish wolfhound, but a larger build and a blunted nose. She got very confused, as when the dog was by one of the walls, she could see the walls through the dog. She then ran to the window to view it more closely, but it just disappeared. Again, her own dog was sitting in his basket, shivering and hackles raised. Both of the Boltons felt their own dog's reaction added more validity to the sightings. The Haunting of Wookey Cottage. For our last visit, we go to a haunted cottage at Wookey. Wookey is famous for its caves and for its delicious cheese, and the discovery of an ancient female skeleton. There is also folklore about a witch being turned to stone in one of the caves, but it's the cottage on the Wookey estate that we'll focus on. The cottage was built in 1878 and was occupied for 60 years by a woman who was later to die in the cottage in 1947. She did not want any electricity connected to the cottage, but after she died, the new owner decided to install it, and it was after this that strange happenings began. A young married couple with their 8-year-old son moved into the cottage. After a week or so of moving in, the young boy had gone to bed, but was soon back downstairs, complaining that an old lady with a white apron was upstairs and was being noisy so he couldn't get to sleep. His mother went up and she too saw the old lady who was walking about the landing. The activity became more frequent and noisy as the old lady ghost would stomp up and down the stairs as well as across the landing, so the family moved out after just a few weeks of living there. Other tenants moved in, but they too complained about seeing the old lady ghost and the noise. With each new tenant, the paranormal activity became worse, with doors being opened and slammed by unseen hands. No tenant stayed long enough due to this, so the owner arranged for a psychic investigator to be in the cottage overnight with her, but there was no activity at all that night. A work colleague of the owner was very sceptical about the goings-on at the cottage, and she said she would happily spend the night there on her own. As soon as she arrived, she felt uneasy, and this prevented her from falling asleep. It was around 2 a.m. when the work colleague felt an icy cold hand on her shoulder, and then saw the ghostly form of a woman walk towards the bedroom door. By the time morning came, she vowed she would never stay there again. Another work colleague, this time a man, said he would spend the night at the cottage. He was unable to sleep properly as there had been a disgusting smell that came in waves, and he couldn't find out where it was coming from. The cottage was blessed in 1954 by the vicar of Wookey, but this did nothing in stopping the disturbances. The noises, the doors opening and shutting, were to go on for around 5 years. The owner had evidence of this activity from 23 people who had stayed the night there. 7 people had reported seeing the ghostly old woman. The activity gradually decreased over time and finally stopped. That's all for this episode, and I do hope you enjoyed these spooky encounters from Somerset. If you've had a spooky experience in Gloucestershire or Somerset, then please let me know. You can email me at mysticaltimesblog@gmail.com. For the next episode, I'll be sharing some very spooky phantom hitchhiker experiences. Till next time.